This is a presentation on how to make STEM courses accessible online. This was a presentation designed by me, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, let's get started. I'm just going to open up the next slide. So who am I? My name is Michael Clark. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a learning experience designer at eConcordia. I got my Master's of Education at Concordia, my Bachelor of Arts at McGill, and I was hired at eConcordia in 2023. I'm also a poet and community organizer. And some housekeeping notes. Just want to let you know that this is being recorded. If you're watching, just turn off your cameras and microphones until the end when we'll do a Q&A. It's a bit of a lecture style, so if you have any questions, just pop them into the chat and we'll discuss them. Using the Q&A button is also a nice feature. So a lot of this discussion will be centered around the course CHME 6031, Chemical Kinetics and Reaction Engineering. It's a chemical engineer course at the graduate level, and it was written by Dr. Alex de Fischer and Marc-Anthony Goulet, PhD. Now, they are the professor, the chair, and assistant professor, respectively, of the Chemical and Materials Engineering Department. Super wonderful, lovely, interesting individuals, and if you get the chance, you should say hi and get to know them. Very, very lovely. Now, who are we who helped make this course at eConcordia? We had Vanessa McCants, who helped me strategize with the accessibility for math online at the early outset and strategize for the content. We had Sybil Diaz-Bossaker, who was my course producer, the hand in glove. Carl Basha was our integrator, and Mariano Pantoja is our content editor and translator, and he's going to come up a bit later in the discussion. So welcome to eConcordia. It was founded in 2001 by Concordia, and it's one of the major, I think the only way to get to develop and host accredited Concordia online course. You can get credits online through Concordia, through eConcordia. So we provide Concordia faculty members with online course development and delivery resources, as well as overall support to the students and professors while the online courses are live. Do you have a course? Do you want to put it online? Come see us at eConcordia. You're going to love it. Okay, so how did we get here? I'm first going to discuss about the rising popularity of online education and also the social model of disability. You might have heard in other presentations by eConcordia colleagues about how online education is getting quite popular. I was interested in a case study of two STEM courses that were offered in 2017 and 18 by Russia's National Online Learning Institution, OpenEdu. It was interesting because they reported lower costs of up to 80.9% with no significant differences in the final exam test scores between the control group, which is your status quo in-person learner who is attending school, and the experimental groups of just online only learning and a blended learning cohort. And this comes from Chirikov et al. Now, this is, let's say, bolstered, or there's a bit more detail here from the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, when Dishu and Yingxu from 2019 echoed these financial benefits, but they warned that the absence of, quote, interpersonal interactions and social presence, end quote, may be deleterious to the learner's overall educational experience. It might result in lower overall satisfaction levels from students. So this brings us to the social model of disability. Gravel et al. In 2015 argued that it is our, quote, our learning environments first and foremost that are disabled, emphasis added. And this is cited in Niemennen and Pisonen, who added on to this perspective. They took a look at the literature for this particular niche and discovered that, quote, the essential perspective of disabled students' perceptions has been lacking in the literature and needs to be addressed. And so this was very much where I was coming from when I first started this course. And I wasn't sure how true this was, so I took a look at Jung et al. I wanted some hard facts. And they have an incredible finding, which is that, quote, all 30 visualizations we sampled from major news outlets did not contain alt text associated with the visualizations. Since visualizations are a critical part of information consumption, this observation is alarming. Similarly, the IEEE VIS and TVCG collection did not include any text alternatives to the figures, end quote. I'll break that down a little bit. So when they say major news outlets, they're referring to the Washington Post, New York Times, and 538.com. And 538.com, their entire business model is just data visualization. It's charts. And even more surprising was the IEEE Visualization Conference. This conference brings together industry and academic experts in the field of visualization. And the IEEE transactions on visualization and computer graphics, or TVCG, they publish peer-reviewed articles on this subject bi-monthly. None of these organizations, academic or modern media, are using alt text, according to Jung et al. From 2022. So this brings me to a quote that of my own, of all things. In education, we often talk about accessibility, ripping off of a metaphor from civil engineers, where if we design a street with ramps, then people who are differently abled, who need the use of a wheelchair, benefit a lot, and so does everybody else, really. But when in quoting myself now, when accessibility is an afterthought, it's like trying to adapt a city street after the concrete has been poured. And certainly it's true that a lot of the knowledge in math is just simply not accessible, especially from papers from the 80s, the 70s, and so forth. Now, Dr. DeFischer expresses this in his own words quite eloquently here.
When we're teaching a course in person, when a student has an accessibility issue, they can let us know directly. When everything is preloaded, it has to be there with all the whistles and bells and all the extras that are needed for accessibility. It has to be there from the onset. We can't, 2 weeks into the course, we can't say, okay, let's do all the accessibility for this course while the student is taking the course. It's just not feasible.
So you can see there, he's expressing the analogy almost in literal terms. Once the course is made, it's extraordinarily difficult to go back and sort of tear it all up and start again. So accessibility online is often done through the use of major screen readers, very popular ones. One way to understand these screen readers is through a website called WebAIM. They publish user surveys. And the 10th one was recently published in December of 2023, and January 2024, they got the data set. There was about 1,539 valid responses, and it was a follow-up to the 9 previous surveys that were conducted since January 2009. Now, of course, big caveat, this is not controlled. It doesn't represent all screen reader users, but it's a nice snapshot from recent history to give us at least a rough idea of the learner base we're talking about. So when we consider disability types, the survey reports that users who have blindness, who are blind, are the vast majority of respondents, followed by I think at, what is that, 78%, and then low vision, visually impaired is at 20%, and then cognitives at 3, deafness maybe 7, motor and other are very infinitesimal, very small. When we consider the proficiency of screen readers, advanced users, 58.3%. Most users of screen readers are advanced, essentially, and the other large chunk, 36%, are intermediate. There's only a very small minority who are beginners, don't really know how to use these tools. The primary screen reader used, and the first one that a learner might use, is still JAWS at 40.5%. NVDA is a close second, 37.7%, and VoiceOver from Apple is the other major slice of the pie at 9.7%, and there are some others that fill in the margins. So we often think about screen readers as having 3 major competitors. When we consider the historical trends for the primary screen reader use, it's very clear the historical trend is that NVDA is eating up the market share. JAWS is decreasing from almost a high of 75%, and NVDA started almost at 0% in 2009 and now is all the way up at like 45% in January 2024. And JAWS and NVDA are almost at parity now in terms of market share. When we consider screen readers commonly used, meaning when WebAIM put out the report, they observed that 71.6% of respondents used more than one desktop or laptop screen reader, and 43% used 3 or more. That's a direct quote. So learners tend to have multiple tools to accomplish the objective. And when we consider that, we'll see that still NVDA and JAWS are near parity in January 2024. And it's still true that the overall trend is NVDA is eating up market share from JAWS, and VoiceOver is, an important competitor. Why is this? It's because NVDA is free. It's hard to argue with that. When I wanted to understand what the data might say for Google Trends. So this is a line chart which describes the Google Trends over the past 5 years. It's the number of searches, or as they call it, the interest over time, for the keywords non-visual desktop access and JAWS screen reader. I couldn't use the keyword JAWS on its own for some reason. Something was messing up the data. And when we use the correct term, the overall upshot of this line chart is that NVDA has had a substantial advantage in the market share of eyeballs, essentially, of people searching, of people querying when it comes to Google. This is emphasized especially at the end of the chart, where NVDA is projected to increase to 100% of market share in terms of the actual interest over time. We don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to corroborate the survey data from WebAIM. Continuing on, what here is the problem exactly? Well, the internet simply was not designed to display mathematical notation in the way that we commonly interact with it in the classroom. And I wanted to sort of make this point very clear, so I made this next slide. This is one line, and this is 2 lines. But when we try to represent an equation, and I really charted it out with lines across every possible segment, I discovered that there were 8 lines. And all of this positioning is helping us read and interpret the equation. Now, of course, this is terribly inaccessible, but making the point that the equation is just built up into smaller and smaller spaces, and generally the internet is not designed for that. It's expecting a language, an English, a French, a German, Afrikaans, whatever. So if we think about PDFs, which are one of the major ways of publishing literature, it doesn't really display mathematical equations unless you place in an image and you put alt text. Very clunky process. Just doesn't have the notational flexibility. So therefore, we use Microsoft's equation editor, and it's quite easy to use for professors who are familiar with mathematical notation. But NVDA, the free screen reader, struggles to work well with it for very complicated reasons we won't get into, but essentially the interfaces don't talk well with one another. Now, Microsoft's built-in read aloud function can also produce some strange bugs. For instance, we're working through one right now where the screen reader just switches to Spanish for confusing reasons. And of course, NVDA is free, but JAWS costs money. And a lot of universities have licenses with JAWS in order to provide it to learners for free, but this is just not true for all institutions. It's still sort of a financial barrier for learners. So we definitely want to use NVDA, and we also want to accommodate people with JAWS, and so we're going to use LaTeX. Now, what is LaTeX and why is it pronounced so strangely? Well, LaTeX is the art of taking some mathematical notation and converting it into code, and vice versa. We can see here from the CHME course a matrix, and that is represented in a logical order by a string of code. LaTeX is designed for the production of technical and scientific documentation. It's free, and it's the de facto standard for the communication and publication of scientific documents. It's what you go to if you want to try to express this stuff online. So how does it work? Let's say for Microsoft Word, a professor might produce an equation and they can convert it, and it changes from professional to linear. And the linear code, as you can, is the same sort of code jargon that was described in the previous slide. We take that jargon and we can put it into an HTML document. If you've worked with Moodle or any other web publishing platform, there's usually a text editor. And in that text editor, you can access the source code or the HTML. And when you publish, it turns out like the equation you received at the beginning. And this is quite nice. This is what might be considered accessible math online. There's two major benefits to this. One is for sighted users. They're able to double click on an equation and it actually expands it, makes it easier to read. For non-sighted users, it is compatible with most major screen readers, with both NVDA and JAWS, because the screen readers are interacting with the LaTeX, with the hard-coded information. Now, that's one aspect of it, of making a course accessible. And one of the other parts is, maybe not the harder part, but the other important piece is the importance of alt text, which is sort of the invisible ink of the internet. There was a really impactful quote that I came across in my readings from participant 21. Quote, "I am visualizing what I am missing. That would be a normal thought in a sighted person's head. I want to imitate the way that sighted people would skim the visualization. I would want to see it the way that a sighted person would think about it from their phenomenological experience. I'm visualizing what I am missing that would be a normal thought in a sighted person's head." This comes from Jung et al. And I thought this was a really interesting perspective from a learner with visual impairment. And it's echoed by one of the professors, Mark Antony. There's a very interesting quote here.
"I myself am a very visual learner. Like, I always ask people, wait, I have to draw a diagram. Like, what are you talking about?" The people that just shoot words at me, it just goes in one ear, out the other. And I need a visual representation of what's going on. And so that's why, to a certain extent, it's very difficult for me to default to like, when I'm reading a big equation, like, how should I read it so that it will make sense to an auditory kind of person. And again, if I were to make a request, it would be, if this was to happen again, it would be to have a buddy, right? To actually have a completely blind person to work with that can like talk to us about like, how do they represent what I just said in their head? Like, how is it represented? Because I don't even know, like, how should I say it so that it's represented correctly, right?
It's a very interesting point, and I'm sure those with an education background are thinking about multimodality or representing information both visually and audibly in order to enhance the success of meaning transmission, of getting the point across, essentially. And we can understand from this that both sides of this equation want to talk to each other. Both the blind person wants alt text, wants to understand the sighted person's understanding of how they decode a visual image. And the sighted person also wants to know how to speak in order to produce the correct meaning in a non-sighted person. There is a lot of desire to get these close together, but low probability just because of the rare skills demanded. So continuing on, a good standard for alt text is to describe the chart type, a brief description, You're going to prime the reader that there's more details coming, describe the axes and range, describe the data trend, and use plain language. I try my best to do this in this presentation, just to give you an example, and we'll go through a more detailed one afterwards. But in terms of visualizations, as we learned, it's super important to have this kind of rich information. In fact, you too can be better than the Washington Post, the New York Times, and 538. I believe in you. It's definitely possible. What are the actual steps to producing this in detail? I took a figure from CHME, figure 8.3, and I adapted some of the advice from Jung et al. To sort of have a nice clear road that you can provide to a subject matter expert or that you could do yourself. We start off with the chart type. You can see a line plot, and we describe the relationship happening in this line chart, a very brief description. Then the axes and range are described, the x-axis, the y-axis, and how far they reach to. And then the data trend is described, the sort of detailed substance of the visualization. And all of this information can be quite tedious to produce, but once you get a feel for it, it's quite easy. Usually the problem isn't how hard it is to produce it, it's just keeping up with it, that every single image that is a visualization that has all this data in it, needs to be explicated and needs to be described to a non-sighted user. Now, I'm a poet and I come from a sort of humanities background, a language background, and I really think after this course that math is poetry and that there's a lot of potential to sort of get stuff lost in translation. Dr. DeFischer puts this really interestingly.
However, now that we're developing online content and we need to maintain accessibility, we can no longer make the assumption that the student is reading the equation as I am reading it. And that changes the rules completely. And it's an entirely new situation. We've never had that situation before. If a student can't read a certain equation, then he can, in the normal classroom setting, then the student will say so. I can't read this. I need some help here. But now we don't have that cue that a student needs additional help. So we need to provide it. We need to make sure that we provide enough context in our reading. And to be honest, that is a situation that we're still grappling with and that we're still getting used to. If you literally give all the clues that are in the equation, then it becomes practically unreadable because we have equations with so many subscripts and superscripts that you lose track of where you are in the equation if you say everything.
That was a really important point and sort of the upper ceiling. We started to run into a new situation. Sorry. This is particularly clear if we consider the Lightboard example, this incredible technology available here at eConcordia. Mark Antony is writing on the board a number of equations that are not simple, they are complicated. And when the information is transcribed into closed captions, for instance, the format of a closed caption strips away a lot of that rich information. So for example, the relationships between terms, or let's say the cancellation of terms, is often represented in graphical terms by crossing out C sub P in, for instance. And there's a whole syntax involved in the position units. For instance, per meter cubed, the per in that sentence is m to the -3. And even in that sentence, you can hear me using a common grammatical words, to the or raised to the 3. There isn't necessarily a single way to express a mathematical notation, and that was a big learning curve for me to understand. Mark Antony gets at sort of this really profound and scary point that even within the personal choice, it's not actually a choice.
Kind of when we read the large equations and we're trying to not take forever, you know, it's kind of personal choice, and even within the personal choice, it's very unconscious. So it's not actually a choice. It's just, oh, now I'm going to say C sub A, but now I'm just going to say concentration of A instead of, C sub A, right? Like it's kind of arbitrary when you're actually reading it. My default behavior is to not repeat myself, right? So I try to add variety, diversity to what I'm saying, and so I try to kind of say it 2 different ways or 3 different ways, so that people get kind of exposed to those different ways of saying it.
Yeah, it's a really wild and interesting response. Mariano, our transcriber, describes sort of what he's seeing, what he's understanding from his perspective.
It's what makes us different from machines, right? Is the fact that like you have a human being teaching the course, and they bring their own personality, they bring their own style on top of their wealth of knowledge into it, and that really stands out. And this is a different thing, right? Like it is trying to be an emulation to an extent of the real in-person experience of education, and it's still very different. It has to be different.
We're in a new environment when it comes to teaching math online. Dr. DeFischer had a very unusual comment about how he might read out one equation differently depending on the time of day. And after thinking about it, he came up with the mood factor, which another very surprising quote.
When you're teaching, you're always trying to strike a balance. Like if you give too much information, it can be condescending. Like it's like that I think that you're stupid. If I say, okay, this is water, this is H2O with 2 in subscript, this is, yeah, that's insulting, right? If on the other hand, I use acronyms and symbols without explaining them, then I'm being obscure. I'm not actually, or pedantic, and I'm actually trying. It seems like I'm trying to make students feel stupid just by talking over their heads. And often there's a fine line between them, especially with a mixed audience. Yeah, and so I think that also has to do with how you approach the syntax of and the pronunciation of equations. So, and I think sometimes one day versus another, you might make that judgment a little differently, and that's, I think, where the mood factor comes in. Like there's going to be days when I'm feeling generous, and I'm going to approach this slightly differently than other days when maybe something happened in my day. I'm going to be maybe a little less patient, and then I'm going to make some shortcuts that I wouldn't make when I'm in a more generous mood.
Sorry, I'm just thinking it's kind of funny that one way we describe that we're angry with someone is that we're short with them, that we aren't willing to spend as much time to express ourselves. And in the same way that there's a level of mood, of patience going into all of these subconscious decisions that might not even be personal. You might just have a tendency to repeat yourself in different ways, like it is with Mark Antony, and then you drop that tendency if you're having a very difficult, stressed day. I find that fascinating. I don't want to pretend that this is all sunshine and roses either. When we were producing this course, I had to develop this math accessibility iceberg chart. I'll give you a moment to sort of digest it on your own terms. Essentially, an image of an iceberg is broken down into many layers, and there's a cross section where a sub is going a bit too deep and might go kablooey. And this is supposed to represent the gradation of courses that are simple math courses, maybe a commerce course, let's say, with simple dollars and cents, and a complex math course like the one we've been doing graduate level. So at the top of the iceberg, you might have basic accessibility as required by law, and you might publish your equations in a downloadable document. It'd be even better if these equations are published using Microsoft Equation Editor and are readable by JAWS, the most popular screen reader that is used according to these WebAIM survey reports. If you have been sufficiently convinced that you can do alt text, that it's not that scary, and you believe it's important, we start filling this gap of knowledge, this invisible ink, then you might produce detailed alt text for all your graphs and visualizations according to the lovely standard set by Jung et al., and that's followed here at eConcordia. You might be a little odd, a little weird like me, and push forward and convert all of the equations into LaTeX so that it's readable by NVDA, the free screen reader, and JAWS, and thus be more accessible to even others. But it was around here that we started to hit a wall where the problems we were engaging with were so difficult that it just would have made the budget go kablooey. So this is a style sheet to systematize all of the rare terms that were being used so that they're saying the same thing every time, or phonetic gestures to describe all of the movements that I'm making, or when I gesture to an equation on the light board, that's information that we're losing in the transcript. We didn't have a buddy that Mark Antony desperately wants, which is an expert review from a blind person of these screen recordings, much less numerous learner reviews of accessible math online. And at the deepest levels, when you really think about it, a lot of the literature, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, just doesn't really produce alt text, and there's not a lot of experiments being done, and not a lot of focus, and there's just fertile territory for researchers and academics to start to solve these problems, and they're quite difficult, as we've seen, especially when it comes to language. So where do we go from here? Well, Mark Antony sets out a pretty solid first step for subject matter experts, for producers, content producers of STEM courses.
You first have to get the people, the content creators, right, the ones who derive, create these equations, create the notations, to come to an agreement in themselves, which they haven't yet, right? So different subjects, especially my electrochemistry background, people come at it from different angles, and they use different terms and notations, and they have different definitions for things. And so, yeah, if you're going to teach the course on that, and try to get a consistent notation, that's you first have to decide on the notation you're going to use.
And the interesting part here is that there is the Chicago Manual, which is a reference list to help standardize notation, mathematical notation. But as we heard from Mark Antony, this might not be applied. He had never even heard of this, and it's something that's only really engaged with at the editor level for producers of texts, and your average professor might not really need to standardize at this level or across the industry, simply because it's working in the class that they are teaching. So that brings us generally to a close. We're at the Q&A section. I'm going to open up the floor in the last 10 minutes for any questions, commentary. This is generally the end. Please post in the chat, use the Q&A function, or turn on your camera and microphone, and you can just ask the question. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending. And this was how to make STEM courses accessible online. My references are available after the fact. And yeah, thank you so much.